Wonderful. So one more time, I'd like to introduce myself, Allison Campbell, here at the Washington State Historical Society. And today I have with me Brian Tarbush, who's the Earthquake Volcano Program Coordinator for the Washington State Emergency Management Division. He's here to talk to us all a little bit about preparing for earthquakes and tsunamis. For some of your museums, I know that you are in a tsunami zone. And this is all part of the Great Shakeout, which is actually an international kind of day of earthquake preparedness. I grew up in Southern California, so I am very familiar with this kind of exercise. And we're so grateful that they reached out to us and wanted to involve museums in this program this year. So I am going to turn it over to Brian and mute myself. And again, if you have questions or things come up, just drop them in that chat.
Thank you, Allison, and good afternoon, everyone. That was a pretty good introduction. So yes, ultimately, we're going to talk about how museums can be safer in an earthquake. There's some that I know, and there's going to be some that I'm going to actually end up directing to you, because as you'll find out, you are actually the experts on this sort of thing. So I wanted to start this off with just kind of a picture of the extreme example of museum earthquake safety. I apologize because this is not going to be very interactive, but I might ask questions anyway. So this is Te Papa in Wellington, New Zealand. It is their national museum. And the reason I wanted to start off with this is because they've started off, let me make sure I can make the slides move. Their entire museum is base isolated. It's built on these rubber pillars that, yeah, this is a massive building. And basically when the ground shakes, pillars absorb the shaking so that the museum itself above it does not shake. When the ground moves, they kind of very slowly adjust. And these are designed to protect everything in the museum, including the visitors. So this is a really impressive way to do this. That takes a lot of foreplanning. It is extremely expensive. I don't have the figures on that. But also as part of the museum, they've turned these pillars themselves into exhibits. So you can go under it and press a button to turn lights on and take a look at the huge structure. No, I'm not saying everybody should go out and do that, but that is kind of the extreme super end of what you can do. So as we come to Shakeout, our international earthquake drill, I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of what some of the things that you can do that are a little bit more normal and what you should be thinking about when it comes to securing your space for an earthquake. So one thing to think about is what is statistically the safest place to be when an earthquake strikes. Got to think about some of these things. Being outside, generally pretty safe, but it kind of depends which part of outside you are. In a department store, there's a lot of things where maybe being near certain shelves might not be very safe. In bed, again, what's above your head. I always say don't keep your bowling ball collection above there if you live in the Pacific Northwest. But in bed is usually the safest place that people are. So it tends to be better as long as you don't keep those things up there. In a car, it depends where you're driving. Bridges can be bad, but we're working on retrofitting those. An unreinforced masonry building, we'll talk about that, and I'm sure that has some of the museums might be historic buildings that are unreinforced. The chemistry lab, definitely some hazards to think about in there, as well as a museum. In any situations, what might be the hazards that you can experience? For example, back in 2001, this is an example of an unreinforced masonry building down in Pioneer Square in Seattle. So we have a 6.8 magnitude squally earthquake that happened in February. So you can see this building, kind of these parapets, the top of the wall just peeled off, and tons of bricks fell off into the street. Now that makes being outside, if you're right on that sidewalk, extremely dangerous. But the thing with these buildings is they're built to stand up straight. They're built to withstand the forces of gravity, but not side-to-side motion. And this unreinforced part is they're not bolted into the floors of the building, into the ceiling as well. So when it moves side to side, they can start to just fall off. Maybe you can reinforce those with some bolts, but until then, they're one of our largest earthquake hazards in the state, because even moderate shaking side to side can cause all those bricks to fall off into the street. Going to think about where you are. So what we've done is put together kind of some animations about things to think about in different situations. When you're indoors, the things you need to watch out for are going to be flying debris, breaking glass. But generally, when an earthquake strikes, drop, cover, and hold on is what we need people to do. And that's kind of situationally, you want to think about dropping as getting as close to the ground as possible, lowering that center of gravity so that you're not thrown to the ground by the earthquake shaking. You don't want to run outside during an earthquake or run anywhere because it can knock you off your feet. You want to control that. You want to drop. Cover, think about covering your head and neck and taking cover. Those are the things you want to protect in an earthquake because things could fall on them and injure you. And then hold on. If you're holding onto a table or a sturdy desk, that might be trying to shake away from you. So you got to hold on for the entire time. So in the Nisqually earthquake that happened, generally when we ask people how long the shaking lasted, and I'm sure some of you experienced it, a lot of them say, wow, it felt like a lifetime. You got to hold on that whole time. Now that was only 30 to 40 seconds, maybe 45 in some areas. When we have this 9.0 Cascadia subduction zone earthquake off the coast, that could be up to 5 minutes or more of shaking. So you got to hold on that whole time if you want to protect yourself. Think about where you might be in some other situations. Driving, it's all about situational awareness, knowing what's around you and what could become a hazard when the ground shakes. And we don't want you to be constantly thinking about that all the time. So the idea of talking about this in a museum setting is, or in any setting, is really think about the places where you spend the most time. Now, if you're working remotely in some cases, think about your home. This is a perfect time to think about those projects. Is your computer on your desk strapped down, or can the monitor fall over? So are these things that you can do that'll significantly improve your safety in the first case, but also reduce your losses during an earthquake, which could strike here at any time. Keep going a little. When an earthquake strikes, some things you can expect. Suddenly there will be a roar, everything shaking back and forth. You might get some lights flickering, going out. Windows can shatter. One of the most common injuries after earthquakes is people cutting their feet. It's really important to be prepared and have kind of shoes so you're not walking barefoot around. If this happens in the middle of the night, get a flashlight, get some shoes under your bed. I'm sure if Allison's from California is familiar with that. The one thing I found last year at the end of November, or 2018, end of November, there was a large earthquake in Anchorage, Alaska. And one of the guys I was talking to, a taxi driver when I was there, was, oh, I was stirring the paint can and then the paint started stirring itself. So I just dropped cover and held on. So yeah, you might get all these different situations, and it's fun to talk to people about it and what their experiences were, but just know that these things will happen and you might be scared, and that is an okay reaction to the ground suddenly moving underneath your feet. But we want people to practice during a shakeout so that even if that fear kicks in, you have what to do in your muscle memory. And if you take the time now to secure things so they don't fall, you don't have to worry about the safety as much. So it's more okay to be scared in those cases. Be prepared and it'll be better. So one of the big things, don't try to run outside. Most of the injuries are caused by falling while moving during shaking or being struck by falling objects. It's that idea that you're safer outside, but you can be a lot safer inside if you're under something sturdy. If we go back again to that picture from outside the Phoenix Underground, if you had tried to run outside over there, which some people did, they were extremely lucky they did not get hit by all these falling bricks. Yeah, we were very fortunate nobody was killed in that earthquake. So you want to stay where you are. So we have a nice example from a 2016 earthquake in Ecuador where this happened. So you see the people begin to notice what's happening. They start getting up to leave the building. And then you start getting this more intense side-to-side acceleration shaking that is almost knocking them off their feet, knocking them right over in some case. I would not want to be in this situation. But the safest place you should be is going to be under these desks, because you can see all this debris flying around. Lights went off in this case as well. Computers are falling over. The safest place you want to be is under something sturdy. If they're up higher on a building, as it kind of looks like here, you really don't want to be on that staircase or in an elevator during this intense shaking. I mean, I've fallen down the stairs when the ground is not shaking. That's just more points you can hit. That's extremely dangerous. It is much better to stay where you are. So I have another example here of that, wanting to step kind of into a safe place out of the streets. This is from New Zealand, and a huge series of earthquakes, over 10,000 of them between 2010 and 2011. So we can watch what happens here. You can see another example of unreinforced masonry building. The shaking starts really suddenly, and immediately that building in the back, the parapets, the walls just kind of peel right off of the building. So these two right here stepped out in the middle of the street. They didn't drop. like they could have. It was better to get down to the ground once you're in a safe space, but they stepped away from the most dangerous parts of the building. They've probably had a little too much practice, and hope nobody has to have that much in this case, but that is where you're going to be safe. Okay. So one thing we want to talk about as well is kind of what our expectation for earthquakes is in Washington. Now here's kind of a fun historical example. The Chelan Fault is our largest historic earthquake that's happened in Washington. It was in 1872 at a magnitude 7.2 earthquake. We didn't really know exactly what the magnitude was because a lot of the settlers out there at the time did not have seismometers. But what we can do is look at the historical records of kind of what they experienced. And there's all these newspaper stories of people like running out of their cabins, and pretty much anything wood framed is going to be a little stronger in an earthquake, but people are going to run outside, and they're all like very unprepared to be outside. And I'm not sure what time of year this one was, but from that you can look at so an earthquake has one magnitude, which is kind of the strength. It's based on the length of the fault that ruptures, how quickly that moves. But what it has more of is these multiple intensities, which is kind of how strong you feel the shaking. If you look here in the red, this is right in the center, and that's going to be the closest to the fault. We have severe shaking. So I'll have an example of what that might mean. But these are considered intensities. It's the Mercalli intensity scale created by the USGS based on those experiences. We like looking at this scale because it has kind of some of these older, more archaic things. Plaster may fall off the walls, or pendulum clocks stop at certain intensities. We're kind of working on modernizing it a little bit so more people understand, but based on these historical accounts, you can kind of understand what the strength of an earthquake was based on how far away someone was from the center and what their description of what they felt is. So if we look at what that is here, we get a little closer. So the area of Chelan in this kind of severe shaking, everybody's going to want to be protecting themselves. Now this is a very high level of shaking. This scale goes up to 10 where shaking is violent. But there's very strong, you're definitely going to get a lot of windows shattered. You're going to get drywall cracking for sure, and shelves falling down unless they're secured. So as we kind of move further away from it, you're going to see lower and lower intensities. I hope you can see the people in here okay. So kind of move into that very strong shaking, our strong shaking, and moderate shaking. So fewer people notice it as you get farther away from a quake. Again, there's one magnitude for this earthquake, it's a 7.2, but as you move further away, you've got these intensities from severe to very strong to moderate. And we can look at these seismic scenarios and try to get a better understanding of what to expect when an earthquake is going to happen. So there's some of these available from our Washington Geological Survey. Kind of get a scenario of what certain faults will look like in your area, because you can look them up interactively, type your address in here. So I can share a link to that later. So here's that Nisqually earthquake we talked about again. It was magnitude 6.8, but you can see the different intensities and how they happened all over the Puget Sound region. But even you get to these weak and light shaking, this earthquake was felt all over the place. And this was largely because it was so deep, it just kind of, these earthquake waves spread out spherically, kind of like a balloon blowing up. So right above the epicenter, or right above the hypocenter, the hypocenter is the spot on the surface where you get the expression of the shaking, but the epicenter in this case was deep underground. So you can see it's more intense in the Olympia region, Tacoma, but this was felt all over the state. People in Idaho felt this, and Oregon as well. The areas that had this most intense shaking were closest there. Also, you get a lot more of this intense shaking in river valleys, places with unconsolidated sediment, on beaches, and you can actually get some liquefaction, which we can talk about in a little while. So one thing we can do is look at kind of our database of these unreinforced masonry buildings and think about what you might expect in different areas. You can see Seattle, and that's kind of a combination of Seattle and Tacoma. The Washington Department of Enterprise Services and Commerce work together to kind of create this initial database of where we have the most unreinforced masonry buildings. It's not complete, it was just kind of a test to see how they might go about it. We tested kind of how old buildings are and whether they're known or not. Anything older than, I think it was 1958, they said this is a suspected unreinforced masonry. Like the city of Seattle has a very detailed inventory that they're working on and trying to work on retrofitting these buildings. But generally knowing where these are is going to be a good way towards taking steps to impact, to mitigate the danger. So one thing you can do is actually look at this inventory. I have the link there on the bottom to kind of see if your building you're in, or if there's any nearby that might be a hazard that you spend a lot of time near. We also focus a lot on protection in schools. If kids grow up learning to drop, cover, and hold on, they can take that wherever they are. We just want to make sure it's not, you get under your desk. You might not always be near a desk. So it's a whole situational awareness, what drop, cover, and hold on means in different situations. But we found that this is extremely effective. That's what they've been teaching and working on. I mentioned this Anchorage earthquake earlier, and here you can see how effective this is. Students, they were just recording this. Earthquake starts, all the kids get under their desk, and the teacher as well. Don't know how fast this is going to start, but it starts shaking pretty intensely there, as you can see from the screen up there. You get books falling off desks, things falling off the walls, and then the lights go out. So everybody in there is okay. This earthquake had very few injuries and no deaths, despite being a huge 7.8. That's a large earthquake. But yeah, what people did is immediately reacted and took action to protect themselves. That's what we would like everyone to be able to do. And you can see that was effective right there. Now, some people will say, what about getting under your desk? How is that going to work when, well, here's the Mexico City 1985 earthquake. You can kind of get that bed of nails effect in some cases where you don't want to step on one nail. You wouldn't want to be under one desk, even though it's definitely better than not being under anything. These are all holding up these floors of the building that pancaked. Our buildings are not designed to pancake. We have very different building codes in Washington. So you shouldn't be in this situation, but if things are falling, even like whole light fixtures, being under your desk is still a much better idea. So get under something sturdy. That's that cover step, take cover. So think about this in your buildings. What are some things you can take cover under? So looking at some of the effects, shaking, the strongest shaking you're going to see is that side-to-side motion. There's a little bit of up and down as well, but we tend to equate shaking to a percentage of the acceleration due to gravity. And not much accelerates due to gravity higher than the force of gravity, or 1g. That would cause something to actually like jump up into the air. The stronger forces are side to side, which can be bad for roads, bridges, buildings, any of these things that are not designed to experience strong side to side motion. So all of these examples are from other parts of the world. I don't have any Washington pictures of that on here, but you saw the Nisqually ones earlier of unreinforced masonry. Liquefaction is something mentioned earlier. So this one in the upper left-hand corner is an example of that in Washington. This is from Tumwater in the Nisqually quake. So what this is when you get this high frequency shaking, the water that is underground kind of moves up through loose, unconsolidated sediments. You might have had done this on the beach. If you ever just stand by the water and shake, you notice that you start to sink in a little bit. That's one example of how this can happen. Sometimes it's more like this lateral spreading, where this water moves up and it starts to kind of spread roads apart. Because roads are meant to lay flat as well. They're not meant to move sideways. So it can actually cause these slips and slumps and landslides in some cases. So some other examples we have in this upper right, sand blows, where just kind of sand moves up into the grass. And then sometimes things can kind of sink and do like a quicksand effect. And these are both from New Zealand around these quakes. The Christchurch one is the most famous, but again, there's a huge series of earthquakes in 2010 to 2011. There is also a possibility. Anytime you start to, well, you can get sparking wires, you can get broken gas lines. So these are some things you need to think about in the places you actually spend some time. Are there connections that might be a danger? And we say don't turn off your gas lines unless you go out, unless you smell gas, unless your meter is spinning wildly, or you hear like a hissing sound from your gas area. They might not be broken, and it might take a while for somebody to come back and turn them on, but you do want to be aware of those. I can post a link to where there's more information on that as well. But this was the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, where after which there was a fire that actually did a lot more damage than the earthquake itself. So there is a possibility ignitions still happen after quakes. And then aftershocks. I've mentioned this sequence a number of times. There were probably over 10,000 aftershocks, some of which were extremely large. We saw that again in Ridgecrest in California last year, where 4th of July, they had, I think it was a 6.8, 6.9 earthquake. And then they had an aftershock, which was larger. These are kind of just your ground readjusting. You get this slip on the fault as it suddenly overcomes that force of friction as it's sliding. I like to think of this kind of as the getting up in the morning. You might have to crack your back a little, and then sometimes like other parts of your back will crack as you get up more. Sometimes one of those will be bigger, but that's a lot less likely. So it's just kind of the readjustment that happens afterwards. You're going to get more earthquakes, mostly a lot of smaller ones. Now the USGS has actually come up with a method based on looking at different aftershock sequences around the world of kind of forecasting what the likelihood is of aftershocks after an earthquake. So you might get things that come up that say, there's about a 3% chance of a larger earthquake happening in the next week or so. They usually go by week, and then 30% chance that there will be a smaller one or something like that. They tend to go by magnitudes. So I'd recommend taking a look at those after any large earthquake, because they're pretty interesting to see. One other thing to look at when we talk about some of the larger earthquakes we might have is cascading failures. So this is kind of getting back to what to prepare for in your particular area and how to secure your space. Any of these earthquakes, like as was mentioned with the can cause fires, think about power going onto large areas, water and wastewater systems, refrigeration, gas and utility lines, communications, supply chains, and more. The thing is bad when these start to stack on top of each other. What if electricity goes out and that stops, well, as refrigeration's on the list, that might cause some food shortages down the line, especially if your supply chain is damaged by roads being damaged, by landslides, people being unable to get across the pass or fly in because an airport is damaged. This is why we talk about preparedness ahead of time, and especially being 2 weeks ready. People will be coming for you, but you're going to have to be self-sufficient in a little while, because you and your community are going to be the first responders that can get to your area. So yeah, all of these things will make other issues after an earthquake more of a challenge. And think about it being in the winter versus the summer and the different challenges associated with that. So I wanted to take one quick step back to talk about something exciting that is coming soon. Our earthquake early warning system, the USGS, or US Geological Survey, has created the shake alert system. So this is earthquake early warning. How that works, what if there was a way to tell you that an earthquake has occurred before the shaking actually reached you? So how this is going to work, when the fault slips, you have the epicenter of the earthquake. So all these little black dots here are seismometers in this area, and we have kind of a station that processes the data, and then maybe a population center over here. So when an earthquake strikes, the first types of waves that come out are P waves, primary waves, pressure waves, and S waves, secondary or shear waves. So the P waves, primary waves, are basically a sound wave. It's very fast moving, travels quickly, it doesn't do very much damage. There's also the S waves, which do a lot more damage later on in the earthquake. They travel a lot slower, roughly half the speed of the P waves. So how the system works, as those P waves travel and start hitting sensors, they detect these fastest waves while the P waves are still coming, or the S waves. As they move through a number, the signals are sent to servers, the earthquake's location and its size are calculated, and then that is sent out to people so they can drop cover and hold on, but also some critical infrastructure can have some automatic reactions, opening elevator doors at the nearest floor so people don't get trapped in those, things like this, making systems automatic. So this is coming soon, but ultimately that will happen as long as you're far enough away from the epicenter to make up for that travel distance. This will provide seconds to tens of seconds of warning before those damaging shaking waves arrive. So with seconds of warning, ideally this is coming spring 2021, at least public alerting, which will be on all mobile phones if you download an app. But what could you actually do with that time? Again, our biggest thing is we want everybody who has this, gets that warning, to drop, cover, and hold on in the most appropriate way to protect themselves. So as we come back to kind of museum preparedness and to wrap this up, I think really I am not an expert on museums, so it is time to ask the experts. Go look in a mirror, because you know your area, you know what might be a hazard there. I'm here to kind of provide the basics of what to look out for, but then how you're actually able to apply that to your situation and think about what the hazards might be in that area. That's really up to you because you know your space. You might know about that pipe that's up there, and if it shakes a little bit, it starts releasing water, something to damage something. Or you might know about that certain part of it. So if we think about some of the most basic questions that you can ask about your area, and worked on these with Allison, how might an earthquake impact safety of you, yourself, and anybody working there, and also visitors? Other things could be fall, that could be damaged. Are there glass cases that could break? Glass breaking is very common in earthquakes. And then you want to think about preserving your space and the museum itself. Are there exhibits? Are there archives? Things that could be at risk? So are there things even susceptible to tiny vibrations from an earthquake? And how could you protect these? And then think about any interconnected systems, any fire hazards. And then the other thing to think about when you're preparing are what are your plans? And do your plans cover an earthquake? If you have plans for generic emergencies, what do you do normally during a power outage? And will it apply to the situation of an earthquake? So you want to think about making sure that first, your people are going to be okay. They're going to be able to return. You're going to be able to leave if they need to. And if they're unable to leave because routes are damaged, are there ways are you planning to supply for them? Just what are your plans? So the main idea here is practice makes perfect. And we think if there's one time per year that you're going to think about what to do during an earthquake, think about those plans and practice. I just say join us for the world's largest earthquake drill. It's going to be October 15th at 10:15. It's the third Thursday of every year. You can register for free. You can register yourself and your family. You can register your whole organization. You can also practice whenever is convenient for you. We realize this year especially is a little challenging for everybody to find the time, but hey, an earthquake can strike at any time. You can also practice at any time. So most basically, you can just drop, cover, and hold on. Hold it for about a minute. Just practice, get that into your muscle memory, what you're going to do. But this shakeout.org/Washington, and they have some resources pages. They go up to full drill manuals, which will be on that newsletter. But some things you can do are actually go through and do a full test of your plans. Just simulate that an earthquake has happened and kind of run through as a scenario. This is damaged, this is damaged. What do we do? Let's test our plans. Let's see if they work. So really how involved you want to make it is up to you. But I just ask that we know an earthquake could strike anytime here, varying levels of damage. They're not all going to be huge, but it could happen. And so thinking about how it might impact you is an important thing to do. So I am happy to stick around for questions. There's some contact info, and we have our WA Shakeout on Twitter, and mil.wa.gov/shakeout is a great spot for resources. If you're looking for games for kids, if you're looking for just things you can give out to people to provide more information. Be a Shakeout champion is our suggestion. If you want to get other people involved, we have resources for that. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. So I already see a great question from Ellie up in Port Townsend about securing shelving, which in a few minutes I will see what Brian has to say on that. But I wanted to take this opportunity to speak about some resources that are out there specifically for museums. And actually, Brian, can I just ask you to stop sharing your screen and I will share a few things. I hope that you've noticed that Len's also been popping some things in the chat, some links, and I'll be sure to send those all out to you via email. But it's 2020, anything can happen, whatever bad can happen does seem to be happening. Seems like a good time to get prepared. And based on my heritage census, we have found that only 36% of the 200 plus heritage organizations that were surveyed actually have an emergency plan in their core documents. I'm sure everybody on this call today is one of those 36% who's already got this all figured out and has a plan, whatever it might look like. But lots of our museums across the state don't have a plan. And so this is something that I'm really looking forward to spending some time focusing on in the future. My colleague, Angeli Grantham, is on the call from Alaska State Museums. She and I went to a big training in DC. I thought for sure I'd spend all of 2020 just talking about emergency preparedness. We did this great Smithsonian FEMA training, and then of course everything happened that 2020 has brought towards us. So I feel like now is a great time to really get back in the head of planning. So I wanted to just quickly share with you, and then we'll get to everybody's questions. I want to share with you a few websites where you can find some things that are really useful. So our goal today is to really, if you don't have a plan, get you thinking about how to start a plan. If you've already got a plan, maybe encourage you to go back and evaluate that plan. We know that there's the shaking, right? But then there's also all of the cascading failures that come after the shaking, which for our collections can be devastating. The fire that's accompanied by the water damage that brings the mold, right? The emergency, the power outage that brings the failure of the HVAC system. These are all things that we need to be prepared for and prepared to respond to. So the earthquake happens and everybody drops and holds on and covers and holds on. Once all of your people are safe, right? Yeah, they're your primary concern always. Once your volunteers, your staff, your visitors are safe, and it's been deemed safe to return to your building, that's when we need to roll into high gear in sort of protecting our collections. So the two things that I just wanted to share, if you're listening to all of this and thinking, oh my gosh, where do I start? I just wanted to push you in the direction of a couple of resources or good places to start. So the Council of State Archivists has this pocket response plan. You've probably heard me talk about it. But it is this front and back legal sized form that you can download, and it's basically all the contact information, all the locations of all the necessary things that you're going to want to have on your body if you're evacuating out of a building and preparing to go back in or preparing to direct emergency managers into your building. It can be adapted for your needs, for your specific organization. This is nothing set in stone. It's just sort of a starting place. But we're going to be doing some trainings in the next year on how to kind of get started filling this out. It's just a great first step, knowing and feeling confident that you have all that information that you're going to need in the case of an emergency. The other thing that I wanted to share with you all, and I hope to get a grant to buy you all one, is the Emergency Response and Salvage Wheel that comes out of the American Institute for Conservation. And it's literally a wheel for how to respond when different types of objects and artifacts are impacted by water or some other kind of situation at your museum. So you literally spin it around and it tells you, like, here's the first steps or here's what to do. And then it's got a phone number to call for heritage responders who can answer questions by phone and that sort of thing. So I'm not a collections manager. I don't work that much in collections. I took a conservation class in graduate school 20 years ago, and all I remember is put it in the freezer. Like that seemed to me at the time the answer to all the problems. You think there's a bug on it, put it in the freezer. You think it's mold, put it on the freezer. Well, it's obviously much more nuanced and complicated than that, and this is going to tell you just those sorts of first steps to stabilize these artifacts. Because you don't want to walk into a situation and just assume it's a total loss. Because there can quite possibly be things that you can do or that professionals can do to salvage those objects. So I just wanted to draw your attention to those two things. I know that Len has also shared in the chat some links to the AAM kind of disaster preparedness kind of resources and all sorts of other things that I hope that you'll take a chance to kind of check out. And like I said, look forward to more programming around these issues coming down the line in the future. But let's go back to some of these questions. So Ellie was asking about freestanding shelving in their collection storage or at their museum. And she was wondering if they should be attached to just the wall or just the floor or both. She's heard that if it is attached to both, it will rip itself apart in an earthquake. So Brian, what are your thoughts on whether just attach it to the walls or walls and floor?
So I haven't actually heard that, but what I would recommend is actually I'm going to post a link in the chat here to Earthquake Country Alliance. So this is a group in California that's done a lot more on kind of the structural side. And they have a lot of fantastic resources on here. This step 1 page that's recommended is secure your space. So on the right side there, it has kind of sections for what's recommended for all these different types. Small objects, electronics, bookcases, shelving units, lockers and storage cabinets, and just kind of what the best thing to do is. I took a brief look with your question, and it looks like pretty much any large shelving unit, you just want to secure it to the wall studs. But I hadn't heard anything about the forces necessarily before. That could make sense. You got a lot going on there. But I would go with what their recommendations are, and you can actually find like, contractors that'll do this type of work for you, or you can do it yourself. So Project Impact in Seattle, I can put a link to that as well. But they do as well have a list of contractors who have taken a 6-hour course to kind of be aware of how to do this type of work. And that can be like securing your house to the foundation as well.
Cool, yeah. I had always heard secure it to the wall studs if possible. And I know in our research center where our archives are, they're open shelves. This is where I'm new to all of this with, everything is sort of secure so it can't fall off the shelf. We have a lot of glass plates and things, right? So it's got the kind of string across the front, any little thing that will kind of keep things securely in their housing, objects in their housing on their shelf, if shaking happens, for sure. So Angeli up in Alaska did have a question. Who should assess a building after a large earthquake to make sure that it's safe to enter? How do you get in that queue following an earthquake? Do you know anything about sort of that process, making sure that your physical space gets assessed immediately following an incident?
Now that's an interesting one. So one thing is a lot of people think that you need to immediately evacuate a building after an earthquake. But that's not necessarily the case. You do need to kind of assess the situation. Again, look, if you smell gas, if there's a fire, if there's arcing electricity, or if there's clear like X cracks in the walls, that's when you're actually going to need to leave the building itself. But other than that, it's possibly likely to be safe. Now, if you leave it, supposedly, you do have to wait for somebody to evaluate in order for you to get back. Now, I think the best person to get in touch with about that would be your local emergency management, because they're going to have that information in your area, who kind of the building inspectors are. It might be very slow after a large earthquake because those people are going to be looking at a lot of buildings. But I think they would have the best idea in your local area about what the local process for getting into that queue is for inspection.
Yeah, that's great. And one thing that I would recommend to everybody is to get to know your local emergency responders and emergency management team, your city, your county emergency management team. Invite them over for tea, bring them to your building, give them a tour. They would likely be responding whether you have a fire or a major leak, some kind of major water damage, or there's some kind of big incident. And the more that you can endear yourselves to them and help them understand the nuances of your building, your space, your collection. We all have hopefully those top items that you want to evacuate out of a space, collection items that are top priority. It might be worth having them come in and showing them how to access those things, or making clear to them what kind of priorities that you have and what kind of access you'll need once people are safe to be back in the building. So definitely get to know them. And Brian has just shared the link to find the emergency management offices all over the state. And that's something that I hope that we can kind of start to facilitate via some of the regional museum networks, the heritage leagues across the state, is maybe putting together some smaller meetings with those emergency management teams so they can get to know your needs a little bit. So there are a few other links that Len has shared in here. The Seattle Heritage Emergency Response Network, known as SHERN, is a group of conservators and collections folks who kind of volunteer to be a part of this team to respond to incidents that are sort of threatening collections. They generally don't kind of work outside of King County, but they're available and great people to ask questions to and to get resources from. I have this thing, something happened to it. How can I stabilize this object? What would you suggest I do first? Do you know of contractors who I can contract to bring out a big freezer truck or whatever? They're going to be a great research for you. But I do also hope that you will call me if and when something happens. If it's a massive earthquake, we'll probably be kind of reaching out to folks and kind of aware, and it's on our radar. But even if you have a smaller incident at your site, a toilet overflows or a roof leaks, please let me know. We want to keep track of those things. We want to connect you to resources when we can, and however we can. And in some cases, once Corona is over, I will come on down and be some more boots on the ground and help you do whatever needs to get done to make sure that your collections are safe. So give us a call. Are there any other questions that you'd like to ask Brian, who is a earthquake expert on the science of earthquakes, that you'd like to throw in the chat there, or even if you'd like to unmute yourself and kind of ask the group? Okay, well, I think he gave us a lot of good information and things to think about. And again, it's such an odd time, right? I can see, as I said, some of you are working in your museums. You've got your masks on. I haven't been back to my museum in 6 months. So if an incident were to happen, I'd likely be here, and I'm looking at this huge bookshelf right next to me that is certainly not secured. So, I'm going to start thinking about and doing my kind of mental risk assessment as I go around my space for sure and think about where I am. Ellie had one more question to follow up on the shelving question. What is the best way to secure mobile shelving for the seismic event? The idea is our closing protocols each evening to prevent as much damage as possible. Should each unit be locked? Just the ends, locked in blocks of 2 or 3 units? I assume the rocking back and forth is not quite like an isolation base and undesirable. My gosh, Ellie, and I'm sure that lots of other people have these questions because many folks have those kind of mobile, what are they called? The shelving, mobile shelving. I'm doing this. And anybody who has them knows what I mean. Space savers, thank you. And I'm not sure, maybe if Anjali has thoughts on that and wants to jump on, or if Brian has thoughts, but I'm going to find an answer for you. Do you kind of understand what we're talking about, Brian? There's shelves that are on tracks so that they can be kind of, yeah. Yeah. So I'm not sure, certainly if they're closed, that would keep things from falling. But I'm not sure with the shaking, what's the best.
Yeah, I think one thing I would say is it's going to be good to have kind of, if you have like a bar or a bungee cord in front of things, that'll help stop them from falling off. I'm not completely sure about them rocking back and forth on their tracks, and I would be surprised if Earthquake Country has something about it, but I would also check that database just to see if they have those on there already. Yeah, it's fun getting people together like this because they always come up with new things that we haven't heard of that are very good questions. So yeah, does locking it tend to stop it from moving very much? Peter says it's often braced on top.
I'm going to do some research on this, and I'm going to email everybody and see if I can find any articles or anything that specifically references um, mobile shelving and that are housing collections specifically. So Ellie and Peter, stay tuned, and I will share whatever I learn out with everybody, including Brian, for the next people who might ask this question. Yeah, no, it's a great question. Thanks, Ellie. Anything else that's sort of out there that I can, questions that you have that are very specific to your space or to museums specifically that I can research for you and follow up with everyone? Yeah, earthquake straps. Stephanie says that straps the unit for sure. Yeah, and there are, so I'm also super aware that some of our museums have the resources to have kind of the fancy and the official and the strap down and the great housing for every object and all of that. And some of our museums and historical societies might not have the resources to kind of buy all of this stuff that's specifically made for the purposes of protecting things. So I'll also try and find some resources that might be useful to museums that haven't already invested in some of the higher priced items to house things. And Angela is saying, I think locking each unit makes the most sense, since then the shelves won't knock together while moving. Yep. In the tracks, and objects are less likely to fall in between units and get smashed. Yeah, that's what I was sort of thinking, it's almost like closing up the suitcase. You kind of, things may still rattle around within that space, but it'll keep them from hitting the floor. But yeah, I'll see if I can find anything more official or scientific, if you will, about specifically that kind of shelving. Yeah, is there anything else you want to leave us with, Brian, before we sign off?
I guess the only other thing I'd say is we didn't really mention tsunami. You said some of the people are in that hazard zone. Just say if you are in that zone, the earthquake might be your only warning. So if you feel that shaking, drop cover and hold on, then get to high ground. Shakeout is an excellent time to practice your evacuation route. Again, get that in your muscle memory. And then you just hope that the tsunami isn't actually there, but you need to be out of the way in case it is.
Yeah, great. And just a reminder, once the people are safe, as you think about your collections and the things that you will want to evacuate from your collection storage or from your space, remember to first bring out anything that's on loan to you from another institution, and then also have that list of those priority items. Of course, we hope you never have to evacuate your collections. And if we do, we hope you have plenty of time to safely get everything to a secondary site. But it's also useful, and it's kind of a good exercise to be thinking about, what are those priority items? Yeah, and we'll, Ellie will also find out if there's any more tsunami information that we can share with you folks in Port Townsend and others on the call who I know are in the tsunami zone. Thank you all so much. I hope to see you on Thursday for our conversation about online fundraising, totally different topic. I hope that if nothing else, this has sort of planted a seed in your brains to get you thinking about how you can better prepare yourselves and your museums and your collections for an emergency. And like I said, we'll talk more about all of this. Expect to hear more from me and from colleagues and friends who I'll invite to present on all sorts of topics around emergency preparedness. Because again, no better time than now, right? So thanks. Look out for an email with some of these links in it from me probably tomorrow, and this recording up on the Facebook page and the YouTube channel. And thank you so much, Brian, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Okay, take care, everybody.